The sun hung low over the dusty plains, casting long shadows over Elijah's solitary cabin. It had been 5 years since he'd last heard the sound of laughter or felt the warmth of a woman's touch. The wind swept across the open land, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush. But there was something different in the air today, a feeling of unease, a distant rumbling that unsettled Elijah's quiet world. "I never wanted a wife," Elijah muttered to himself, standing on his porch, watching the horizon. His words were a reminder, a mantra he'd repeated to himself after losing Martha, his wife, and their unborn child all in one brutal night. He had buried them both with a promise to never open his heart again, not to anyone. But life, like the relentless winds of the West, had a way of sweeping even the most stubborn men off their feet. Elijah's eyes narrowed as he saw them. Two riders, emerging out of the swirling dust. They were moving fast, their horses kicking up a storm as they raced toward him. His instincts, honed by years of solitude and quiet observation, told him something wasn't right. He could see the desperation in their movements, the way they clung to their saddles as if their lives depended on it. Within moments, the riders had slowed their horses to a stop at the foot of his porch. The older woman, her face lined with worry and fear, immediately dismounted. "Please, sir," she called out, her voice hoarse, strained. "Just one night. We don't mean any trouble." Elijah didn't move, his boots firmly planted on the wooden planks. He stared at her, unsure whether to reach for his rifle or offer his help. His life had been quiet, ordered, and without drama. He'd built his home to be a fortress against the world, a place where he could live alone with his grief. But the woman's eyes, desperate, pleading, made something stir within him. She was older, maybe in her 40s, but there was strength in her gaze. She held herself with the dignity of someone who had known loss, someone who was used to survival. Behind her stood a younger woman, barely a woman at all. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, and her hands trembled as she clutched a small bundle to her chest. Elijah couldn't see what was inside, but the way she clutched it, so tight, as if it were the only thing keeping her from breaking, told him it was precious. Before he could say anything, he heard the sound of hooves again. This time, the sound wasn't from two riders, but from a full group. 6 men, including the woman's brother-in-law, Silas, were riding hard toward the cabin. Dust swirled in their wake, and the air seemed to tighten as the men drew near. Elijah's hand instinctively reached for the rifle slung across his back. He had no use for trouble, especially from men like Silas, who had made it clear in the past that he didn't take kindly to outsiders or any woman standing in the way of what he wanted. Silas had been eyeing Catherine's land for years, and now it seemed he was ready to take it by any means necessary. The older woman, Catherine, seemed to notice the same thing. She turned quickly, her voice urgent. "Please, sir, they'll kill us if we don't get inside." Elijah could see the fear in her eyes, but it wasn't just the fear of death. It was the fear of losing everything, of being powerless in the face of a man like Silas. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt something other than numbness. A flicker of something. Maybe it was compassion, or maybe it was the weight of his own past loss, made him step forward. "Get inside," he said, his voice low but firm. "Both of you." Now, Catherine didn't hesitate. She grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her inside, the younger woman moving like a ghost, still clutching that bundle tightly to her chest. Elijah watched them disappear into the cabin, but his eyes never left the riders closing in on the porch. Silas and his men arrived a moment later, dismounting without ceremony. Elijah didn't flinch. He had lived on this land long enough to know how to handle men like these. He stepped forward, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the men. "This is my land," Elijah said, his voice steady. "You've no business here." Silas, a burly man with a crooked grin, spat on the ground before him. "Your land? You think it's going to protect them? They're nothing but widows. Unfit. And you, what are you?" some hermit living in a shack, hiding from the world. Elijah's grip tightened on the rifle, but he didn't draw it. He wouldn't give Silas the satisfaction. "These women work for me," Elijah said, the words coming out before he could second-guess them. "They're under my protection." The lie hung in the air, but Elijah knew it was his only option. In this world, the law rarely favored women, and without a man to vouch for them, Catherine and Sarah would have no chance. Silas sneered, clearly unimpressed by Elijah's bluff. "We'll see about that," Silas muttered. "This ain't over." The riders turned, and, as quickly as they had arrived, they were gone, their horses kicking up dust as they rode off into the horizon. Elijah stood alone for a moment, staring after them. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. Far from it. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him. The decision to let these women into his home, to risk his solitude for their safety. But as he turned back toward the cabin, he saw Catherine and Sarah standing by the window, waiting. The silence between them felt heavier than it had before. They were strangers still, but now they were three souls bound together by fear, necessity, and an uncertain future. Elijah closed the door behind him, locking it with a loud, final click. The danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but for the moment, they were safe. And that was enough for now. The question that lingered in his mind, though, was this: what would happen when the next storm hit? The first light of morning filtered through the cracks in the cabin shutters, a pale reminder that the world still turned, despite the upheaval of the previous night. Elijah had always woken early, out of habit, and today was no different, though now the silence in the cabin felt different, more alive. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the scent of wood smoke from the stove. It was a small thing, but it made the cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a home. Catherine was already up, quietly tending to the stove, the rhythm of her movements calm and steady. She looked like she knew exactly what she was doing, despite the upheaval that had brought them here. Sarah, on the other hand, sat at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes distant. She hadn't spoken much since arriving, and Elijah didn't push her to. He knew grief could make a person retreat inward, and he understood the weight of that silence all too well. The awkwardness of the previous night's encounter hung in the air between them, the three of them trying to find a new rhythm. Catherine, without much fuss, began organizing the morning chores. She took charge of the cooking, making a pot of stew from what little they had left, while Sarah seemed to slip into the role of cleaning. Elijah worked outside, more out of necessity than desire. His land had to be tended to, and while the presence of the two women made it harder to focus, he couldn't afford to let the place fall apart. As the morning wore on, Catherine's quiet authority became more apparent. She didn't give orders, but she led without question, managing the small household with a calm precision that Elijah found oddly comforting. She was efficient, too, handling everything with a sharpness that surprised him. Sarah's quietness, however, was harder to ignore. She worked methodically, but her movements were stiff, like she was still trapped in the shock of what had happened. Every so often, her eyes would dart toward the bundle she had brought with her, the bundle she hadn't let go of since arriving. It was a small child's toy, a simple wooden horse, but to Sarah, it seemed to carry all the weight of the life she had lost. Elijah didn't ask about it, but the sight of the toy made him think of his own loss, of Martha and their unborn child. He had never fully healed from that night, and now, it seemed, neither had Sarah. But Catherine, strong and practical, was a different story. She seemed to understand without words the pain that both she and Sarah carried, and her strength became a kind of anchor. At the same time, there was a distance between them. They were all strangers, after all, trying to carve out a life together under the same roof. Yet in the quiet of the cabin, they began to establish a tentative rhythm. Each of them performed their duties, not as an obligation, but as a way of maintaining a fragile sense of normalcy. As the day stretched on, Elijah began to notice small things. How Catherine would glance at the worn photograph of Martha on the mantel, her gaze soft but understanding. How Sarah would stop, for just a moment, when she caught sight of the small toy in her hands, as if it were a reminder of all the things she had lost. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Elijah feel that the walls between them were starting to come down, bit by bit. When evening came, the cabin had a strange warmth to it, a kind of quiet comfort that Elijah hadn't realized he had been missing. Catherine sat down by the fire, reading aloud from an old book she had found in a box of forgotten belongings. The words felt foreign to him, but there was something soothing in the sound of her voice, in the way the rhythm of her speech filled the empty spaces in the cabin. Sarah sat quietly, her head tilted slightly as she listened, though her eyes were focused on the flickering flames. Elijah stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, listening. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. It wasn't that they had become a family, not yet, but there was a sense of belonging, of something beginning to take shape. As the days passed, their routine continued, awkward and quiet at first, but slowly becoming more natural. Catherine took charge of the kitchen, while Sarah, though still distant, began to help with the animals, the care of the horses and the chickens giving her something to focus on. Elijah found himself taking fewer trips outside, drawn in by the warmth of the cabin, by the quiet camaraderie they were building. One evening, after they had finished dinner, Catherine caught sight of Elijah standing at the door, staring out into the distance. "It's dangerous out there," she said quietly, her voice full of something softer than concern. Elijah didn't answer at first, his gaze still on the horizon. He didn't need to tell her the truth, that his fear wasn't for the land, but for the people inside the cabin. "Silas won't stop," he finally muttered, more to himself than to her. "He's not the type to let things go." Catherine didn't reply, but Elijah could feel the weight of her understanding. She knew exactly what he meant. The danger was real. The world outside the cabin was full of men like Silas, men who would do anything to take what they wanted. He couldn't protect them forever, but he would try for as long as he could. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Elijah found himself staring at the ceiling, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had brought these women into his home, into his life, but what did he owe them, really? Was it just a matter of protection, of keeping them safe? Or was it something more? He didn't know the answer, but one thing was clear: things were changing. And whatever came next, he wasn't sure he could turn back. The danger was out there, and it was only a matter of time before it came knocking at their door. Word traveled fast in small towns. In the days that followed, whispers and gossip about the three of them living under one roof spread like wildfire. Elijah could feel the eyes of the town on him the moment he stepped outside. It wasn't just curiosity, it was judgment, wrapped in the form of polite smiles and hushed voices. Two widows staying with a man who was clearly more comfortable with solitude than society. The town had a way of making things feel larger than they were, and as Elijah made his way to the local store, the stares were unmissable. Two women in his cabin? What's he up to? Taking a pair of widows. Poor things lost everything, and now they're stuck with a hermit. These whispers followed him through the dusty streets, their sharpness like daggers, even if they were never spoken aloud. The church ladies were the first to call upon him, in a flurry of concern for the women's propriety. They knocked on the cabin door one morning, their faces drawn with disapproval, their eyes wide with judgment. Catherine opened the door to them, offering her usual calm, but there was a firmness in her voice that sent a clear message. "We're not here for your charity. We're staying with Elijah because it's safer, and he's a man of his word." The ladies didn't know how to respond, their attempts to encourage Catherine to stay with a more respectable family in town falling flat. The tension in the air was thick, but Catherine held her ground, her posture unyielding. She wasn't about to let anyone make her feel small or shameful. Sarah, though, stayed quiet during these visits, her presence barely acknowledged by the women who came calling. She still didn't speak much, and when she did, her voice was soft, as if she were still trying to find her place in a world that seemed to have turned upside down. But her silence didn't go unnoticed by Elijah, who had begun to see it as a kind of shield. She was no longer a stranger to him, but a part of his growing, albeit complicated, family. Still, the social pressure mounted. A week later, Sheriff Harris, a man who knew Elijah by reputation but little else, dropped by to check in. His warning was direct, his words wrapped in a thin veneer of politeness. "You've got Silas and his kin on your back now, Elijah. You're making yourself a target with all this talk. People are starting to wonder if this situation is, well, proper." Elijah listened, keeping his face neutral, though his hand rested just within reach of his rifle. "I don't care what they think," he said, his voice steady, though his words weren't entirely true. "I've had worse to deal with." The sheriff, a man who wasn't particularly interested in Elijah's personal business, let out a sigh. "That may be so, but Silas isn't a man who backs down easy. You're putting yourself in the middle of something that's bound to turn ugly." The sheriff's warning hung in the air long after he left, and Elijah found himself growing more protective of the women. Protective not just of their safety, but of their dignity. They didn't need the town's approval, but the weight of the gossip, the stares, the insinuations, they were real, and they were starting to take their toll. Catherine, however, seemed unfazed by it all. She went about her tasks with an air of quiet authority, cooking meals, cleaning, managing the household as if nothing had changed. Yet Elijah could see the strain in her eyes. He could see the weight she carried, not just from her loss, but from the way the town viewed her. How, in their eyes, she was nothing more than a widow, her value only in relation to the man who controlled her fate. The women had nowhere else to go, and the law was stacked against them. In the eyes of society, they were nothing without a man to claim them, to protect them. The deeper Elijah thought about it, the more he realized how fragile their situation was. Their safety rested in his hands, and yet the law didn't recognize his protection. It didn't see them as individuals, but as property that Silas was determined to take. As the days went on, Elijah's quiet life began to fray at the edges. He found himself getting up earlier and staying up later, working harder than ever to keep the land in order, to keep the family safe. There was something strange about it, too. A sense of responsibility that he hadn't known he could still feel. For the first time in years, he felt a need to defend someone other than himself. Catherine began to take on more responsibility as well. She managed the household with ease. But there was something else in her that Elijah noticed. A sharpness, a determination that went beyond what he had seen before. She wasn't just surviving. She was fighting for her right to exist in this world just as much as he was. Sarah, though, remained a mystery. She still didn't speak much, and when she did, it was usually to Elijah or Catherine, but never to anyone else. She kept to herself, her world contained within the walls of the cabin. Yet, slowly, she began to open up in small ways. One evening, when they were sitting down for dinner, she laughed, quietly, but it was there. And that sound, though small, was the first real sign of healing Elijah had seen from her. They were all broken in some way, but perhaps they could still make something out of what was left. A week later, things escalated. Silas and his men made their first real move, leaving threatening notes on the fence posts around Elijah's property. It wasn't enough to warrant a visit from the sheriff, but it was enough to raise the stakes. Elijah knew then that it was only a matter of time before Silas would make his next move, and this time, it wouldn't just be threats. The danger was closing in, and there was little they could do but prepare. Elijah found himself teaching both women to use rifles. The world outside the cabin was still full of dangers, and if the law wouldn't protect them, they have to protect themselves. That night, as they sat around the fire, Elijah realized something. They weren't strangers anymore. He could feel the shift in the air, a growing bond between them that was hard to name. Catherine, Sarah, and him, they had all suffered, all lost, but they were surviving together. And that, he thought, was something worth fighting for. The courthouse was crowded, the air thick with tension, whispers swirling through the room like an unwanted storm. Elijah stood in the back, his hands folded tightly in front of him, trying to steady the pounding in his chest. He had known this day would come, but knowing it and facing it were two different things. The judge's gavel rang out, and the room fell into silence. Silas sat at the front, his smug smile barely contained as he watched Catherine and Sarah take their seats at the witness stand. The women, though resolute, couldn't hide the nervousness in their eyes. Catherine's calm exterior masked the storm of emotions that had been building since the moment Silas filed his claim. Elijah could see it in her posture, the tightness in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the chair. The law, in its cold and distant way, didn't care for people's hearts or histories. It only cared about what could be proven. And in this case, Silas had the advantage. His lawyer was a seasoned man, sharp-eyed and calculating, with a mind built for twisting facts and manipulating words. The first witness was Catherine, her voice steady as she recounted the events that had led her here. She spoke of her late husband, of the land they had worked together, and of the betrayal that came when Silas sought to take what was rightfully hers. Her words were measured, dignified, yet the undertone of grief and anger couldn't be ignored. But the lawyer had a way of digging deeper, of finding cracks in the armor. He attacked her emotional state, questioning her stability after the death of her husband. "Your grief must have clouded your judgment, Mrs. Wren," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "How could you possibly be fit to manage your own affairs in such a state?" Catherine didn't flinch. "Grief didn't steal my mind, sir," she replied, her voice a quiet force. If anything, it clarified it. Elijah felt a surge of pride for her, but his heart sank as the lawyer moved on, trying to undermine her strength by suggesting that her decisions, her very ability to care for herself, were rooted in a fragile mental state. The questioning grew harsher, the room grew colder, and it was all Elijah could do to keep from standing and shouting at the lawyer to stop. But Catherine held her ground, answering each question with a calm resolve that made Elijah admire her more with every word. Sarah was next. She hadn't spoken much throughout the trial, her grief still too raw, but now she had to face the courtroom. Elijah could see the fear in her eyes as she made her way to the stand, clutching the wooden toy horse that had never left her side since she'd arrived at the cabin. Her voice was small when she spoke, fragile, as if the act of simply being there was an overwhelming challenge. The lawyer wasted no time in attacking her, focusing on her lack of experience, her inability to make decisions, her emotional state. "Can you manage the farm, Miss Sarah?" the lawyer asked. "Do you even know how to take care of yourself?" His words were sharp, designed to tear her down. She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. I know how to work," she said, her hands twisting the toy in her lap. "I've worked all my life. I've done everything I can to help, to survive." But the lawyer wasn't finished. "And what of the future? How will you support yourself without a man to guide you?" Elijah's heart ached as Sarah shrank under the onslaught. Her eyes darted to Catherine, and for a brief moment, Elijah saw the same vulnerability in Sarah that he had seen in himself when he had lost Martha. The world didn't give people like Sarah a chance. It judged, and it left them to fend for themselves. Elijah could see the way the townspeople watched, the way they waited for Sarah to falter, to confirm their worst assumptions about her. He knew how easy it was to be written off as broken, unfit, unworthy. But he refused to let Sarah be defined by those who would tear her down. As Sarah struggled to find her voice, Elijah felt a sudden surge of anger, not at Sarah, but at the world that had placed her in this position. She wasn't broken, she was surviving. And that, he thought, was a kind of strength the world didn't understand. He had always been a quiet man, but today he couldn't remain silent. When his turn came to testify, Elijah stepped forward, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a man of words. But he knew the truth of the women's strength, of their resilience, and he would not let that be overshadowed by lies. I've known these women since they first set foot on my land, Elijah began, his voice steady despite the unease that twisted in his stomach. They're the hardest workers I've ever known. They've been nothing but capable and determined in the time they've spent with me. They deserve to keep what's rightfully theirs. The lawyer pounced immediately. And perhaps you have other reasons for keeping them close? He asked with a smirk. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. They work for me. They've earned my respect. The lawyer's gaze turned cold. I see. But isn't it true, Mr. Harding, that this arrangement is unusual? You've been living with these women under your roof. Isn't there more to this story? Elijah's heart raced as the room seemed to hold its breath. He had to make a choice now, a decision that would either make or break their future. He took a deep breath and turned to the judge. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying the weight of something deeper than mere words. There's something you should know. I made my decision. Silence fell over the courtroom. Elijah's gaze never left the judge's eyes. I intend to marry Catherine. Have for weeks now. A stunned gasp rippled through the room, and Elijah could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. Catherine's eyes widened, but there was no hesitation in her expression, only a quiet, steady certainty. The judge turned to Catherine, his voice low and serious. Miss Catherine, is this true? Do you consent to this? Catherine looked up at Elijah, her gaze soft but unflinching. She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I do. The courtroom went silent, the weight of Elijah's words settling into the room. The judge cleared his throat. Then, by law, a married woman is under her husband's protection. Case dismissed. As the room buzzed with murmurs, Elijah's heart thudded in his chest. He had done it. He had made a choice that wasn't just about the law, but about something deeper, something real. As they left the courthouse, Catherine pulled him aside, her voice low. You didn't have to do that, Elijah. You didn't have to trap yourself. Elijah met her eyes, his expression softening. Started as a strategy, but standing there, I realized it wasn't a lie anymore. Catherine didn't speak for a moment, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She understood, and in that understanding, Elijah realized that they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something worth living for. But as they walked away, Elijah knew that Silas wouldn't give up that easily. This battle might have been won, but the war was far from over. The sky hung heavy with smoke that evening, the distant horizon a blur of orange and red as the sun sank low, casting an eerie glow over the land. Elijah had always been a man who preferred solitude, a quiet existence. But now, with the cabin full of life, there was a constant undercurrent of tension that he could never quite escape. After the courthouse, he had hoped for a brief reprieve, a moment of peace. But as nightfall settled in, the air grew thick with the sense that something was coming. He sat on the porch, eyes scanning the horizon, his hand resting on a rifle at his side. The stillness of the land was broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, the chirping of crickets, and the soft murmur of voices from inside the cabin. Catherine had taken to preparing the evening meal, the smell of stew and bread filling the small house. Sarah, though still quiet, had taken on more of a presence in the cabin. She moved more freely now, though her eyes still held the weight of her past. Elijah had learned not to press her for more than she was ready to give. She would speak when she was ready, just as Catherine had learned to do over the years of her own losses. The day had been uneventful, and Elijah had hoped it would stay that way. But as he sat there on the porch, the uneasy feeling in his gut grew stronger. He could feel it, the shift in the air, the deep sense of something wrong just beyond the edges of his perception. His instincts, sharpened over years of living alone, were telling him that danger was closer than he wanted to admit. Then, just as the last light of day disappeared, he heard the sound. Hooves. Fast, heavy, the sound of horses galloping toward the cabin. Elijah stood up immediately, his hand gripping his rifle tightly as he scanned the night. In the distance, he saw the figures emerging from the dark, silhouetted against the flames of the setting sun. Silas and his men. It didn't take long for Elijah to recognize the pattern. They were riding hard, and they were coming straight for him. He could hear the shouts as they approached, their voices rising in the cool night air. Silas had clearly been waiting for the right moment to strike, and tonight, it seemed, was the night. Elijah didn't wait to see how many of them were coming. He moved quickly toward the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, Catherine was still at the stove, her back to the door. Sarah was sitting at the table, her eyes distant, her fingers twisted nervously around the wooden toy she had carried with her. The cabin, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed fragile, exposed. Elijah rushed to the door, throwing it open. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice low and steady, though a thread of urgency ran through it. "Lock the door and don't come out." He didn't wait for a response, his eyes already scanning the land again. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer. He had no time to waste. Catherine didn't argue. She grabbed Sarah by the arm and pulled her into the back room, shutting the door behind them. Elijah quickly turned, moving toward the barn. It was the most vulnerable part of the property, and he knew that if Silas and his men meant to hurt them, that's where they would go first. As he moved, Elijah's mind raced. This wasn't just about protecting them anymore. It was about protecting everything: the land, the life he had slowly begun to rebuild, the fragile hope that had started to grow since Catherine and Sarah had come into his life. The barn was only a few yards away, but it felt like miles. As he neared it, he saw the riders on the horizon, their shadows stretching long as they approached. The flames from the setting sun bathed the scene in an unsettling red light. Then, without warning, he heard a shout, a command, and the world exploded into chaos. Silas and his men had arrived. They were holding torches, their faces twisted with rage and malice. "Burn it down," Silas shouted. "If I can't have the land, neither will you." The torches flew through the air, landing near the barn, their flames igniting the dry hay with terrifying speed. The fire took hold almost immediately, the flames licking at the edges of the barn, the heat radiating in waves toward Elijah. Panic surged through him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Sarah and Catherine would be trapped inside the cabin, unable to defend themselves, and the horses were still in the barn. The fire would destroy everything if he didn't act fast. Without a second thought, he ran toward the barn, his mind a blur of action. As he neared the flames, he saw the horses inside, panicked, kicking and whinnying in fear. The smoke was thick and the heat was unbearable, but Elijah pushed forward, fighting the urge to turn back. He had to get the horses out. He reached the barn doors just as the roof groaned under the weight of the fire. The smell of burning wood and hay was choking, but he didn't hesitate. Inside, the horses were in a panic, desperately trying to escape. He shouted, trying to calm them, but the smoke made it difficult to see. The door to the stall was jammed, and the heat from the fire was unbearable. Just as the barn roof above him creaked, a sharp cry came from behind him. "Sarah!" She was running toward him, her face pale with fear, but her eyes locked on the horses in the barn. "The horses will die," she screamed. Elijah didn't hesitate. He turned, grabbing Sarah by the arm and pulling her toward the barn. Together, they pried open the door to the stall, leading the horses out into the open air. The smoke was thick and the heat was unbearable, but they made it. They had saved the horses. But just as they turned to escape, a beam from the ceiling above cracked and fell, narrowly missing them as they scrambled towards safety. Behind them, the barn collapsed in on itself, the flames consuming it whole. Elijah pulled Sarah into his arms, both of them gasping for air, their lungs burning from the smoke. They had made it out alive, but the battle wasn't over. Just as they reached the edge of the property, they heard the sound of hooves approaching again. This time, it was Jonas, accompanied by the sheriff. He had been waiting for trouble, and now it had come. Silas and his men were caught, trying to flee the scene, but the sheriff had arrived just in time. The law would take care of them now. Elijah stood in the night, Sarah in his arms, Catherine at his side, as the last of the flames flickered out. They had been through fire, and now they were free. But as he looked at the wreckage of the barn, Elijah knew that Silas wouldn't give up easily. The danger wasn't over yet. The fire had burned away more than just hay and wood. It had burned away any illusion of safety. 3 days after the fire, the air had cooled, and the land was quiet once more. The smoke from the flames had long since dissipated, and the once scattered ash that had settled on the land now seemed a distant memory, replaced by the fresh scent of earth and growth. The cabin, though still bearing the scars of the fire's fury, had been cleaned, the broken windows mended, and the front porch swept clean of debris. Inside, the atmosphere was different. There was an undeniable sense of renewal. The decision had been made. Elijah and Catherine, after weeks of silent understanding, had spoken their truths and realized the next step they needed to take. The fire had forced something to the surface, something deeper than fear or loss. They had saved each other, but more than that, they had found a kind of love that didn't ask for permission but simply existed. The cabin, which had once felt like a lonely tomb, now had the hum of life in every corner. Catherine was busy with the preparations for the wedding, though the ceremony would be simple, small by the standards of society. There would be no grand celebration, no big dress, no lavish guests, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the promise, the choice to start again, to choose each other despite the past. The women in town, who had once whispered their doubts, now offered their help without hesitation. The store owner's wife, Martha, had found a dress, a modest but beautiful thing, the kind that felt timeless in its simplicity. Sarah helped Catherine with the final touches, brushing her hair, her hands gentle but full of warmth. Sarah had been transformed over the past few weeks, her silence slowly turning into a quiet strength, her soft laughter a sign of the healing taking root in her heart. Her eyes, once clouded with fear and grief, now sparkled with something lighter. She had become more than just a girl who had suffered loss. She had become a part of something more. Elijah had watched Sarah's transformation with quiet admiration. She had found something that had been lost in her life, hope. And though she had yet to fully find her place, he knew the woman who had come to his doorstep was no longer the same person who had left her home behind. Elijah, for his part, was more nervous than he had been in years. He had never been one for ceremonies, for anything that seemed unnecessary. But today, as he stood in front of the cabin, his heart felt like it was beating for the first time in a long while. He wore a clean shirt, his boots polished, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to hope. The simple, unadorned ceremony took place just outside the cabin, under the open sky. The sun had set, the sky turning soft shades of pink and lavender, as the preacher, an elderly man from town who had seen his share of life's hardships, spoke words of commitment and promise. Catherine stood beside him, a quiet elegance in the way she held herself, her hands clasped in front of her, as if trying to steady the emotions that threatened to spill over. Sarah stood beside her as a witness, a soft smile on her lips, though her eyes were slightly misted with emotion. Elijah's hand trembled slightly as he took Catherine's, the moment too big to be contained in any single gesture. But when he looked into her eyes, everything else faded away. There was no past, no grief, no loss. There was just her and him standing together in this moment, ready to start something new. I thought I'd lost my chance at partnership, Catherine said, her voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. Thank you for proving love comes when we stop demanding it on our terms. Elijah, a man who had never been good with words, spoke simply. You taught me grief doesn't have to last forever. You taught me doors are meant to open. The vows were simple, but in their simplicity, they held all the weight of everything that had come before. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty. They exchanged rings, simple bands, symbols of a life they had chosen together, a life that would not be defined by what they had lost, but by what they would build. As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, a cheer rose from the small gathering of neighbors. The people who had once whispered doubts, now standing behind them in support. There was no grand feast, no music beyond the fiddles and voices of those who had come to share in this quiet joy, but there was a warmth that filled the night. Laughter echoed through the cabin, the first real sound of happiness Elijah had heard in years. Sarah stood at the side, watching the couple, a soft smile on her face as she caught Elijah's eye across the room. Her journey, too, had begun to take shape, and though she still carried the weight of her past, she had found her place in the small family that had come together. Jonas, the ranch hand, had become more than just an employee. He had become a part of their circle, his quiet but steady presence a source of comfort to Sarah. And as the night stretched on, Elijah and Catherine shared their first dance, clumsy but full of tenderness. For the first time in years, Elijah didn't feel the weight of grief pulling him down. There was something new, something worth living for, and it was standing before him, in the form of the woman he had promised to protect, and the new family they had forged from the ashes of the past. Later, as the guests began to leave, Catherine slipped her hand into Elijah's. They stood outside, watching the stars begin to prick the sky, their hands entwined. "Do you think Martha would approve?" she asked, her voice soft. Elijah's smile was gentle, but his heart felt full in a way it never had before. "She would have loved you. She would have wanted this for me." And in that moment, standing together under the vast expanse of the sky, Elijah realized that he had found something he never thought he would again. Peace and the quiet promise of a future shared. The night was still, the stars bright above them. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah didn't feel the fear of the past. There was no longer any question about what came next. They had a future now, a future built on the choice to love, to live, and to build something new. As they made their way back into the cabin, hand in hand, it was clear to Elijah that this was just the beginning. The life he had never wanted had found him anyway, and it was more than he ever could have imagined. A year had passed since Elijah's life had been irrevocably changed, and now, as spring bloomed across the vast expanse of the land, there was a sense of transformation not just in the land, but in the people who had once been strangers to one another. The ranch, which had once been a lonely outpost on the edge of nowhere, was thriving, its fields lush with crops, the cattle fat and healthy. The barn, rebuilt stronger than before, stood tall against the horizon, a symbol of endurance and hope. The cabin, which had once felt like a place of sorrow, now radiated warmth, its windows open to the world outside, inviting the air, the sun, the life that had come to inhabit it. The land had come alive, and with it, the family Elijah had never expected to have. The garden that Catherine had painstakingly tended was flourishing now, rows of vegetables stretching toward the sky, a patchwork of colors that seemed to mirror the peace that had settled over the household. The small orchard of fruit trees that had once been barren had begun to yield fruit, the apple trees laden with blossoms, the promise of a new harvest hanging in the air. The ranch had become something more than just a place of work. It had become a home, a refuge, a place where life was lived fully, not merely survived. And at the heart of it all was Catherine, standing tall as she had done for the last year, no longer just the quiet widow who had fled from Silas' grasp, but a strong, capable partner in every sense. She had found her place, and it was here, on this land, in this life. Elijah had watched her grow in ways he hadn't expected. Her confidence had deepened. Her laughter had become a part of their daily rhythm, and the way she moved through life with grace had become an anchor for them all. But it wasn't just Catherine. Sarah, too, had transformed over the past year. When Elijah had first opened his door to her, she had been a broken young woman, lost in the grief of losing everything. But now, standing on the porch with Catherine, her belly round with the life she carried, Sarah had become someone entirely different. She had found her own path, her own future. She had come into her own strength, no longer the silent, fearful girl who had fled her brother-in-law's cruelty, but a woman who had chosen to build something of her own alongside her family. Her eyes were brighter now, her smile more frequent, and the way she walked, head held high, was a far cry from the fearful, fragile woman who had entered the cabin a year ago. She had healed, and part of that healing had come through the love and support of the family that had taken her in. Elijah's heart swelled with pride every time he looked at Sarah, every time he saw her work alongside him in the fields or help Catherine in the kitchen. She had found her place in their world, and though she had her own journey ahead, she had learned, as Elijah had, that the past didn't define them. It was the choices they made now that mattered. There was still a quiet sadness in Sarah's eyes, but it was tempered by the hope that she had found not just a family, but a future. And then, of course, there was the new life that had come with spring. The baby was due soon, and Catherine had spent the last few weeks preparing, sewing tiny clothes, setting up the nursery in the small room that had once been Elijah's solitary space. Elijah had watched her with a tenderness that he hadn't thought himself capable of before. He had never expected to find love again, never thought he could bring himself to hope after losing Martha and their child. But now, as he sat beside Catherine in the evenings, watching her tenderly stroke her belly, he knew that he had found something that was beyond his wildest imaginings. A family, a life, and a future that he never could have anticipated. The once lonely ranch was now a place of growth, of life, and of love. And though Elijah could never forget the grief that had shaped him, he had learned that life went on, that love didn't erase the past, but built something new from it. As Catherine's due date drew nearer, the anticipation grew in the air. There was a joy that filled the cabin, a quiet excitement that hummed between them all, even as they worked the land. Elijah had found himself thinking often of Martha, of the life that might have been, but now he understood something different. His love for Martha didn't take away from his love for Catherine. The two were not in competition. They coexisted, each one honoring the other, just as the past and future could coexist if you allowed it. Sarah, too, had found a sense of peace in the knowledge that her future was hers to shape. She and Jonas had grown closer over the past year, their quiet courtship something that had blossomed into a tender bond. Elijah had seen in the way they looked at each other, the small moments of shared smiles and soft touches that spoke volumes. It was a love born out of understanding, born out of the shared experience of loss and survival. Sarah's heart was healing, and Jonas, though quiet, had a steadiness to him that Sarah needed. He wasn't the kind to rush into anything, but in his eyes, Elijah saw the same quiet strength that had drawn him to Catherine all those months ago. As the sun dipped low in the sky one evening, Elijah sat on the porch, the familiar rocking chair creaking beneath him as he rocked back and forth, lost in his thoughts. The cabin behind him was alive with the sounds of laughter, of Sarah and Catherine preparing dinner together, of the evening rituals that had become a comforting part of his routine. The land stretched out before him, quiet and peaceful in the fading light. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. From the moment Catherine and Sarah had arrived, everything had shifted. He had never wanted a wife, never thought he could love again, and yet here he was, with a woman who had brought him back to life, with Sarah, who had found a new sense of purpose, And with the new life that was about to be born, a symbol of all the good that had come from his willingness to open his heart again. He heard Catherine's voice from inside, her soft laughter carrying out into the night. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah didn't feel the weight of loss pressing down on him. He felt a sense of fullness, a sense of wholeness, as if the gaps in his life had been filled by the very people he had once believed he couldn't live without. He had opened his door, not just to two women, but to the possibility of a new life, a new family. And in doing so, he had found something worth living for. The past would always be with him, but now it was woven into the fabric of his present, honored, not erased. Elijah felt a hand on his shoulder, and when he looked up, Catherine was standing beside him, her belly round with their child, a smile on her face. "Ready for this next part?" she asked, her voice full of warmth and understanding. Elijah smiled, his heart full. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." As the night stretched on, the stars emerging in the sky above, Elijah knew that this was only the beginning. There was more to come, more love, more joy, more life. And for the first time in a long while, he was no longer afraid to embrace it. The door to his heart had been opened wide, and the future was waiting for them all. The family they had chosen was strong, and together they would face whatever came next as one. The story of their lives was still being written, but for now, Elijah knew one thing for certain. He was home.